this is a generic slide that explains kind of what the Fed does. And so it's buying bonds from banks, certain banks, and putting cash into the system. And to the question that we had earlier, it generally is electronically printing money. It's not making paper money to do this. It just sends that cash to the banks in exchange for bonds. And that cash gets its way to Main Street businesses that are borrowing from their banks. And then in exchange, those Main Street businesses are sending mortgages or auto loans or credit card loans or business loans, anything to Wall Street. They're packaging them up as part of a securitization product, and that becomes part of those bonds that the Federal Reserve is buying. So the Federal Reserve prints money. Whenever I say print, I usually mean electronically. There's a funny side show that's going on now I've seen, which Congresswoman Tlaib brought up, which is the Fed the Treasury can mint $1 trillion coin and deposit it at the Fed. So technically, the government does not have to issue new bonds to finance its spending or even collect tax revenue. The spending comes first, which I'll get into in a little bit when we talk about this idea of modern monetary theory, or MMT. But just understand that the federal government cannot run out of money. It can print as much as it wants. The only constraint you have is inflation, which for the most part, as Carl talked about earlier, we're not seeing across the economy, although you will see some things like I've certainly seen, and my wife has mentioned, certain grocery products that the prices have jumped. So you'll see different kinds of little areas where there's a demand and supply imbalance, where a lot of people want something that's in short supply, like toilet paper, or other things that the prices jump. I heard this anecdotally about a month ago, but orange juice prices apparently are way up. People want it because it helps your immune system under these conditions, and at the same time, there's been some disruption in what's going on. I believe whether it's labor getting to the fields or something with the harvest, but you've got a supply problem and a demand problem, and you've got prices going up. So, but right now, inflation is not a major concern, and it's unlikely to be while the unemployment rate is heading toward an all-time, at least since the Depression, record level. All right, next slide. So there you go. So when you talk about this thing called the Federal Reserve balance sheet, this is the amount of those bonds that it's bought. So it prints money, puts that out in the world, and in exchange it gets bonds. So that the bonds are that Federal Reserve balance sheet, they call it. You know, it's like any company has a balance sheet. It's got assets on one side and liabilities and equity on the other. And the Fed has all these bonds, which are its asset. So people owe the Fed, in theory. It owns those. It's got those bonds. It has purchased those bonds. And you can see, though, that despite the fact that the Fed balance sheet has gone up enormously, and that's on the left scale, that's the blue line, that's dollars in trillions. Back around the time of the financial crisis, the Fed only had about $1 trillion on its balance sheet, a little less actually, in 2008 at the left side of that graph. And then over time, you've seen how that number has been creeping up, and then it plateaued around 2015 to 2018. Started to fall a little bit, and they realized it was causing some problems in the markets. And so then now all of a sudden, boom, you know, another couple $1 trillion of money printing has happened in a very short period of time. And whoever's doing the marking is doing a phenomenal job. Whoever our marker is on the ball. That's exactly right. So, but during all that time, inflation has sort of been moving in this range from 2010 all the way to now. Has really been in this 1 to, it looks like 3 on the graph if you look at the right-hand side. It's been more like averaging around 2. And we have actually seen inflation go down. That red line is going down despite the fact that blue line is skyrocketing. So far, whatever the Fed is doing in terms of printing money has not caused inflation. And the reasons are that there is slack in the economy when you've got so many people out of work. The Fed can do that, and inflation doesn't jump, except, again, in certain specific categories that may have some other disruptions. But just you'll sometimes hear people say, well, if the Fed is printing money, we're going to get inflation, and that is definitely not necessarily going to happen. Ben Bernanke said something, I'm not going to quote him, I'll paraphrase him, but he said something to the effect that depressions are a monetary phenomenon, meaning the money supply contracts enormously, and it's up to the Fed to make sure that it does what you're seeing in this picture, that it prints money to make sure that the money supply is not contracting. And it is most certainly doing that. We're doing its best. Now, in terms of what is on the Federal Reserve balance sheet is in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. Don't go just yet. Mostly government bonds, the treasuries. It's also got a lot of mortgage-backed securities, which are mostly Fannie and Freddie Mae qualified securities. And it's got a lot of more complicated stuff I'm not going to get into, but those are the big ones. The treasury securities and the mortgage-backed securities are where where most of that $6 trillion Fed balance sheet is what's mostly held by the Federal Reserve. All right, let's go to the next one. So what the Fed's been up to in the last couple of months here is what's happened is signs that businesses were having trouble getting loans, interest rates on things interest rates on loans for small businesses or higher risk businesses were jumping. And you see that on both sides. The left side shows the difference between it's called a BAA corporate bond relative to a 10-year treasury. And a 10-year treasury you can think of as risk-free. There's no default risk. There's always some inflation risk, but not much. But there's always a risk of default with a security that isn't a treasury bond. You're always going to get your money back from the treasury, whether it's in strong dollars or weak dollars, you're going to get your principal back. But if you are an investor who owns a corporate bond, there's no such guarantee. As an investor, that bond could default. And so that's why there's always going to be a difference in this premium that they call it. So what's happened is that premium spiked, which means it's hard for corporations to get loans. They're paying a lot more for those loans. And so the Fed intervened to lower that. And they've had some success. You can see that it's been coming down after that spike. And for what it's worth, last month, we talked about this. We were only halfway up that curve. And now we're all the way up to the top. So it's jumped, but still, it hasn't. In the left-hand side graph, the peak was 6.1 in the Great Recession, and we're at 4 something. And then on the other side, you've got the cost that banks charge each other. So it's called the TED spread. And it's been jumping, but following a similar pattern. The Fed has been intervening to knock that amount down. And that's what banks are charging each other. So when it hit 4.5% during the Great Recession. So it's not that bad, but it's still elevated. And that's why when you hear that, what they call the alphabet soup of Federal Reserve programs, there's always programs that are targeted at these markets. They name them, and they act to make these curves come back down toward the more historical averages. So what you're seeing now are tension in financial markets where money's getting a little more expensive for middle grade companies to borrow, or for banks that are lending to each other that are charging more money. So this idea, and I covered a little bit of this, and I'll tell you, I'm not an expert. I'm not an economist by trade. I'm not an MMT expert. And I can tell you that economists like Paul Krugman get into fights with MMT people from time to time about MMT and what it means and exactly what its tenets are. But here's my best understanding of what this is. And the first 4 items I'm going to mention on here are not the controversial ones. They're sort of a description of how things work. I mean, one of the aha moments of MMT was saying, listen, people, once the government legislates spending, the Federal Reserve will create the money necessary and deposit it in those accounts. So it is, or it'll give it to the Treasury deposit. Either way, the mechanism, the money gets into the accounts for all that legislated spending, like we're seeing now with the CARES Act. The government didn't just suddenly get, 2.3 trillion by itself and just crank that out. The Fed helped them out there. So you don't need, and that's the first point, which is the government doesn't have to tax first. In other words, it doesn't need to have cash sitting in an account. The Fed can just do it for them. It can pay the money. So you legislate first, spending is second, and then the government can decide, doesn't want to issue bonds or print $1 trillion coin, mint $1 trillion coin. Does it How much taxes should it do? And so there's a decision made around how to finance the deficit, but the fact is the spending can always be done as directed by legislation. And that, believe it or not, as strange as that seems, again, one of these first four items, not controversial to people that live this stuff. Number two, we can't default on the dollar. If we owe a debt denominated in dollars, a treasury bond, we can't default. We can only default, and it's a weird, many of you heard about it, the debt ceiling can cause a problem, but if we didn't have a debt ceiling, we can always print money to pay whatever obligations the government has. Also not controversial, I've seen no less than Alan Greenspan said exactly that, almost verbatim. And he's not exactly your typical liberal. The inflation is your real constraint, that if for some reason you were printing money when the economy was booming, you could have so much demand in the system that people start jacking up prices. So if the government gave everyone $1 million, or had back in February, if I knew that everybody in America had $1 million and I own a shop that's selling goods, I'm going to jack up my prices. But when the economy is doing what it's doing now, you don't have that problem. So it's all about, you know, if you're worried about inflation, you should be worrying about creating excess demand. That is not a problem we have with 20% unemployment. Number four, when the government, let's say the government does run a massive deficit like we're running now, and the economy is booming and you start to get inflation. The way you can address that is by doing things to reduce that deficit. So you can raise taxes. And another way that's more complicated, and I don't fully understand, is that you can issue bonds and drain some money from the system. If you think of it as the Federal Reserve has injected all this money into the system as directed by the Treasury Department, directed by legislation, if you issue bonds, people give you that money back and they get the bond. And so that's a way of also moving money out of the system. And then the last one is the more complicated one. Traditional economics that we all studied in school says that if the government is running a huge budget deficit and it's issuing bonds like crazy, it's demanding savings. It's trying to get savings from people they want people to give the government the savings in exchange for a bond. If the government's doing that and the private sector wants to do that, then you get a problem where you have what's called crowding out, where interest rates are driven up. MMT people dispute that entire mechanism and say that, you know, you're not going to have crowding out if the government is printing tons of money and the system is being chock full of electronically printed money. You won't have scarcity. The companies that want to borrow can borrow. The government wants to borrow, it can always borrow, and you don't have it. So that number 5 is where the real debate is about the effect on interest rates of MMT type policies. And that's where you'll hear Krugman and MMT people getting into it. But there's really not a lot of dispute about numbers 1 through 4. So any questions on that page? I'll pause there, or comments that you want to make, because this isn't, people in their mind are very much attached to this idea that the government's got to get its money from taxes or bonds, and it doesn't actually.
Hey, David, I got a question. This Bill. So I kind of get it from the last meeting we had, and now you're reinforcing it here. The government can print money and flow it through the system. Thus, the banks have the money and they can lend it out to small business, etc. And so back in 2008, when the economy basically collapsed, the Great Recession, why didn't that happen? I mean, literally, money just stopped flowing. Is this a new concept?
No. I think the Federal Reserve really intervened dramatically. I think one thing that's different now is they learned their lessons of 2008. And there's a slide that I didn't include in the final version here, but it shows that the alphabet soup of Fed programs were implemented almost immediately here. Whereas those things had to be invented in some cases, and the Fed faced a lot of resistance, internal and external, to suddenly printing an enormous amount of money. I mean, someone probably would know what Trump said back then, but typically, if you're a strong dollar advocate, when the Federal Reserve starts printing money, people freak out and think inflation is going to happen and that the dollar is going to be ruined and devalued. And so the Fed had actually fought a lot of resistance during 2008 to implement monetary interventions. And if you go back just for a second to that, let's go back to that slide that showed the Fed balance sheet and inflation. I can use that as a visual. There you go. That's it. So you see the Fed back in 2008 did about $1 trillion of money printing. You see that big spike there? 2008, it looks like late 2008, early 2009. So about $1 trillion in that jump. Look at the one they just, and if you go back a little, you see there's kind of a step up and then a big step up. If you look at that gap, and you have to look at the left axis, it goes from 4 to 6. So it's almost twice as much money printing in a very short window of time. They learned their lesson. They did 2 trillion of what they did, and they only did 1 trillion of it during the Great Recession. So I'm kind of repeating myself, but they learned. They had to invent this stuff on the fly back in 2008 and 2009, and these programs rolled out over probably I'm going to guess a year, or let's say a year and a half. And I'm guessing that, but it wasn't right away. This one, they did it in a period of, where are we now? This stuff hit mid-March, and we're already in mid-April, and they did them all. So, I mean, you've got a 10 times compression in terms of how fast the Fed intervened this time, because they learned that they can do it and there's no damage. Like the inflation, they were actually worried about deflation back in 2008 and 9. Now, you see that inflation spike right there. There was, if I'm not mistaken, there was a giant spike in oil prices about that time. Kind of a weird thing happened with, I don't know exactly why, Carl may remember, but there was a giant spike in oil prices, and then we went right to deflation. We went almost to zero. And I don't know, Carl, do you want to comment on that? Was it that inflation jump there in 08? It wasn't Fed money printing. You can see that it started long before they started printing money. It was something else.
Well, I remember, I've often told the story that my brother decided in May of 2008, late April, early May of 2008, that he wanted to take a Route 66 road trip with me. And that was when gas prices were over $4 a gallon in Chicago and California, and pretty high everywhere in between. So yes, it was high gas prices in May of 2008. Great time for a road trip.
Yeah. And those prices cratered shortly thereafter. I just don't remember what it was that caused that sudden spike in oil prices. But I guess back to your question is, Fed intervened a lot stronger, faster this time, and they didn't face the kind of hurdles they had before when they were, facing a lot of austerity thinking on the monetary policy side. Like here, and I've told some of you guys this story, I may have said it last time. When the Obama stimulus was proposed or went through the House and Senate, no Republicans in the House supported it, and only 3 in the Senate supported it. Still passed, because luckily we had enough majority to do it, but almost no Republican support for the Obama stimulus, and we were losing about 700,000 jobs a month at the time, and had been for a few months. Contrast that with today, unanimous Democratic support for the CARES Act, and in the Senate, and a House voice vote. I'm not sure what the technical terms, if you call that a unanimous consent, but they didn't even the Democrats didn't stop it in the House. And so you've got not only an entirely different world we're in of the way people think about budget deficits, that we didn't really need to do all the austerity that we did. The deficit was not really the threat that people said that it was. And remember today, because if a Democratic president is ever in office and you're hearing Republicans saying, look at our national debt, how big it is, we got to cut spending. They'll never say raise taxes, right? So they'll say, we got to cut spending. We can kind of say, maybe, maybe not. Japan somehow gets by with 250% of GDP debt. Their debt is 2.5 times the size of their economy, whereas the U.S. it's about 100. It's going to be about 100 when you look at what's called the part that matters. The debt held by the public is going to be about 100% of GDP by the end of this fiscal year, if my math is right with what Carl was talking about earlier.
So your slide, Tenets of Modern Monetary Theory, raises a couple questions, maybe?
Yeah, go for it.
If I'm remembering correctly, one of the traditional definitions of money was that it was a storehouse of value, typically presumed to be the value corresponding to the fruits of some labor, whether it was goods produced or services performed. Is this a redefinition of money, or is the old definition really wrong, or is the government somehow creating all that value when they do that? What's sort of going on here? Because I think that's really sort of why people thought it would be inflationary.
It's written on the piece of paper that you're holding in your hand that's printed in green. It is a note. A note is debt. Period.
I'm not sure how to answer the question with the right terminology. I'll say a couple things. One is that
Christine was right. That's the end of it.
maybe it's that simple. I don't know. I mean,
It's tracking debt.
Yeah.
Now, here's the really funny thing. Whose debt? That piece of paper was printed was with permission of the government from our federal bank, the Federal Reserve. It's a Federal Reserve note. What's fascinating about that piece of paper and that note is it has no interest rate. So we just trade this debt back and forth to each other, okay, just as a mean of tracking, a pretend value with each other. That's why monetary theory starts to make sense when you realize there's no value behind that piece of paper. It's only a tool to negotiate exchange.
and if this doesn't bake your noodle, one of the things MMT people say a lot is they say, ready for this one? They say the purpose of taxation is to give value to the dollar.
Mm-hmm.
In other words,
Right.
the taxes drain dollars out of the system. So the government injects all this money into the private sector, and then the government says, well, we're going to take some of that back in taxes. And it's that act of taxation, and in other words, limiting the supply of the money, bringing it back out of the system, is where the dollar, that's the demand and supply part that determines what a dollar can really buy. And at least so far, from the Great Recession and so far in this one, we have not seen inflation despite massive amounts of Federal Reserve electronic money printing. And let's hope that stays the case. Again, I am a little worried that at some point we may have disruptions like you guys heard. There's a pork plant or pork factories that close because of terrible incidents of the coronavirus, and that's caused some prices to jump. So if you've got an actual supply problem, or in some cases a demand increase, like I mentioned with orange juice, everybody's worried about getting sick, so they're ordering stuff with vitamin C in it. Then you can have inflation, but you're looking for general across the board inflation. And we got a little help today. I don't have a slide on this, but some people may want to comment that you've heard oil prices went to zero or close today.
I hear they closed actually negative.
They
West
closed
Texas
negative.
Intermediate
Futures.
closed.
Yeah.
So if you want to fill your car, they'll send you a check.
Well, we're not seeing it at the pumps yet, though, unfortunately.
Well, not negative at the pumps, but a whole lot lower than we had a couple of months ago.
Yeah, it's gotten better. The other side of the question with all of this is, if deficit spending is not bad, were we wrong to fault the Republicans and the current president administration for having done it?
I think you're right in that the MMT people would say, you keep printing money and doing whatever you have to do until everybody's got a job. Everybody that wants to work. And so if you have people that are employed part-time for economic reasons, we showed that slide earlier, if there's a few million people, they would say, keep printing that money and bring the deficit more until all those people are working. So it's your definition of full employment. Are we really there? It's hard to know. Economists don't agree on what full employment exactly is, only that it's somewhere between probably 3 and 5% unemployment rate. They've been lowering it every year. As it keeps falling, they keep lowering the rate at which they think inflation will suddenly kick in. But yeah, I mean, you could have run a bigger deficit. You certainly could have in the early Obama years. He kept spending flat he spent less in 2014 than 2009, which is amazing considering historically government spending goes up about 5% a year. That was an amazing piece of austerity that Republicans still complained about big government spending, but I mean, it was not by 2015, I think the deficit was below historical average relative to the size of the economy. So you know, it was pretty tight. Where they ran there was a lot of austerity going around there in those few years, and that's why one of the reasons the recovery was so slow. We're not making that mistake now, but we'll see. I mean, you know, if we may have to do a lot more stimulus than we've done, or that's not the right word. Relief is the right word. Relief. Stimulus is a term generally used when you've got a shortfall in demand that's moderate, not huge unemployment. You want to boost things. This is not just trying to get people to go out and spend. This thing is trying to help people that have been pushed to the sidelines by government fiat in some cases. So it's a little different. But relief package, stimulus, whatever you want to say, it could be bigger than it is now. And I think Carl mentioned they're looking at another 400 and something billion for the small business loan. So let's move on. But I would say yes. I mean, until you see the whites of inflation's eyes, you can keep shooting the stimulus. So